I'm Brooke Moore, news anchor at WDTN here in Dayton, Ohio, and I'm honored to moderate tonight's Town Hall Forum, Election Essentials, a deep dive into Issue 1. Voting, as you know, is a privilege, and I value any opportunity that connects voters with experts who can answer questions and help make the issues on the ballot as clear as possible. With that said, the purpose of tonight's forum is to help educate voters before they cast their votes this coming November. It's an important election with two very important issues on the ballot, so tonight we will only address Issue 1 here in this forum. Many people believe that the outcome of Issue 1 will determine whether Ohio is a pro-life or pro-choice state, and it goes even deeper than that, changing the Ohio Constitution, which, as you know, is a very big deal and should not be taken lightly. The Issue 1 on the November ballot is also not the same Issue 1 that was on the ballot during that special election a few months ago. This issue would change Ohio's Constitution, and Ohio voters have to wrestle with that idea before casting their votes. So tonight's forum, Election Essentials, a deep dive into Ohio's Issue 1, is sponsored by the Center for Political Studies here at Cedarville University, where Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is the director. He's joined tonight by Aaron Bayer, the president of the Center for Christian Virtue in Columbus, and together they will present the information about the amendment and what's at stake, and it will then be up to all of you to decide when you go to cast your ballot this November. So following their opening remarks, they're then going to take questions from the audience here in the DeVries Theater and from those watching on the live stream. If you have a question, you want to text it to this number, 937-971-3977. I know they're on some of the cards that are out there on the seats, but for those that are live streaming, we want to repeat that number. So if you have questions tonight that you would like answered, that number is 937-971-3977, and they're going to answer as many questions as possible tonight. So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then they're going to come up and speak for a few minutes before we get to the question portion of the evening. Aaron Bayer is the president for the Center for Christian Virtue, or CCV, which seeks the good of their neighbors by advocating for public policy that reflects the truth of the gospel. Under Aaron's leadership, CCV has led efforts in Ohio to enact life-changing and life-saving legislation, including bills to prohibit abortion at the moment a heartbeat is detected in an unborn child, expand Ohio's school choice programs, and protect religious freedom. A native of Warren, Ohio, Aaron met his wife Maria at Ohio University, where they both graduated from the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism, and along with their two daughters, they live in Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith is the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities and the Director for the Center for Political Studies and Professor of Political Science. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith teaches courses in American politics, constitutional law, and research methodology and data analysis. He's authored numerous reference journal articles, book chapters, and other publications, and his primary research interest is in the field of religion and American politics. Before joining the faculty here at Cedarville, Dr. Smith taught at Tulane University and Calvin College. Dr. Smith also serves as the director of the Center for Political Studies here at Cedarville University. So with that, I believe we are going to start with Dr. Smith. He's going to come up and give his remarks first.
Good evening. Welcome to Cedarville University, and for those of you that are on the live stream, welcome as well. I want to thank Aaron Bayer for coming to campus to share with us his perspective on Issue 1. I want to thank Brooke Moore for serving as our moderator. And finally, I'd like to thank two people who made this event possible. Mark Weinstein, our Director of Public Relations here at Cedarville, and Emma Blakemore, who works with me in the School of Arts and Humanities. I want to thank them for their hard work. On November 7th, Ohioans will vote on Issue 1, which is a constitutional amendment. This amendment, if passed, will make Ohio a state that protects abortion, in some ways throughout the entire pregnancy. If we split states in America down the middle, Issue 1 would make Ohio one of the progressive states when it comes to abortion. I want to say up front that I am against Issue 1. In some ways, this is an easy talk to give. Right? We're at Cedarville University, which has a clear position on the sanctity of life. The doctrinal statement, which is signed by faculty every year, says that we believe, quote, God created humans in his image, and we believe and the, quote, divine blessing of children, including preborn children. Now, I affirm these statements, which makes issue 1 an easy vote for me. Most of the audience and probably those watching online have a similar point of view. So I'm not sure if I need to spend my time persuading you how to vote. Though if you're on the fence, I pray that you would protect human life in all phases on November 7th. But I would like to do 2 things with my time. I want to put issue 1 in a bigger context of the abortion debate unfolding right now. And I also want to look at some of the specific language in issue 1, especially the parts that are the most contested. Now, for many of you, you already know what I'm about to say, but of course, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey last year in the Dobbs decision. After the Dobbs decision, we've seen a wave of political activity across the country. When the court decided Dobbs, the court did not take a substantive position on the issue of abortion. But the court did decide that for now, abortion is a political issue because there's no constitutional right to an abortion. So now the issue is decided by the people and their elected representatives. What had existed before was a protection for abortion until the fetus was viable or when it could live outside of the womb. However, during this time, states could also regulate abortion in important and significant ways. They could make abortion illegal after viability. However, they had to allow exceptions for the mother's life or health. States could also regulate abortion before viability, as long as those regulations did not create what the court called an undue burden on the mother's right to choose an abortion. Under this standard, states could and did pass things like 24-hour waiting periods or requirements for informed consent, which means that a physician has to give the mother very specific information about her pregnancy before she can have the procedure done. States could also require parental consent for minors who were seeking an abortion. So all of those things were acceptable under this undue burden standard that existed at the federal level because of the Supreme Court's decisions. After Dobbs, we've seen 14 states essentially ban abortion. We've seen 7 states where there are significant restrictions at 6 weeks, 15, or 18 weeks. And in 4 states, there are ongoing legal disputes about legislation, mostly to see if it fits with the state's constitution. Ohio is one of those states. Right now, our law is in dispute. So that's 25 states. In the 25 other states, there are significant protections for abortion, either until viability, which is usually around 24 weeks, or there are virtually no limits at all right through the entire pregnancy. Especially important for Ohio, I think, is that there have been efforts in Michigan, Kansas, and Kentucky to amend those state constitutions to either protect life or to protect abortion. In all of those states, the pro-choice position has been victorious at the statewide ballot. So let's look at some of the specific language in issue 1. And I apologize, I know this is not a course in constitutional law, but some of the language is specific and it gets a little bit technical and we have to talk about what it could possibly mean. So let me read from issue 1 itself. Every individual has a right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions, including, but not limited to, decisions on contraception, fertility treatment, continuing one's own pregnancy, miscarriage care, and abortion. Now there's more to it, and we'll talk a little bit more here in a moment, but there's a very real concern that the word individual is so broad that it could include minors. If taken at face value, this would mean that a minor would have a right to make a decision about abortion without parental interference or consent whatsoever. This is why so many people have cast the issue as a matter of parental rights as opposed to a matter of abortion. Now, I want to preface what I'm going to say with a disclaimer. I am not an attorney. Don't pretend to be one, have never been one, will never be an attorney. I study, teach, and write about constitutional law, so I have some insight, I would say limited insight, into some of the technicalities at work. However, it is common in the law to allow government to restrict or regulate rights and freedoms based on age. For example, driving or purchasing a firearm, those are limited by age. Even something like consent changes based on age. So what could be considered, for example, consensual sex between adults might be classified as statutory rape between an adult and a minor. The principle is that minors are not able to give full consent because of their inability to grasp the impact of their decisions. Now, this is just me. I'm not speaking for anyone else, but I think there's a chance that if Issue 1 passes, the state of Ohio could still regulate to protect minors, even with this language that we see in Issue 1. However, that would require the General Assembly to pass regulations. It would require the Ohio Supreme Court to make decisions, and they would have to interpret the language in such a way to make that possible. So as you notice, there are lots of uncertainties with what I just said. It's possible that Issue 1 could allow the state to still regulate to protect minors and to protect parental rights. It's also possible that it would not. So that's certainly up in the air. The other complicated part of the language is in that first sentence as well, this phrase reproductive decisions. Every individual has a right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions, including but not limited to the list I read before. This included but not limiting to creates an issue. And the question is really pretty straightforward. Does this language include choices about transgenderism, about hormone therapy, about surgery for transitions, or something else? Now, I want to quote from Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, who's written specifically about this, and this is what he says: given the uncertainty of the breadth of the terms reproductive decision and individual, as discussed above regarding parental consent for abortion, challenges are certainly likely, with outcomes uncertain. It would certainly be too much, he says, to say that under Issue 1, all treatments for gender dysphoria would be mandated at the minor individual's discretion and without parental involvement. However, he concludes and says this is a developing area of the law nationally, and all that could be said with certainty is that Issue 1, if passed, would impact the analysis of any future law. So if I read him correctly, he's saying that it's possible this language could be used to include transgender issues. But again, it's not definite. We would have to see how the courts would deal with this. Lastly, let's talk a little bit about Section B of the amendment, of the proposed amendment. Again, reading directly from the text, it says, the state shall not directly or indirectly burden, penalize, prohibit, or interfere with, or discriminate against an individual's voluntary exercise of this right. This language, directly or indirectly burden, is really the knot here, I think, in this thing. It's hard to know, again, how the courts might interpret that language. If it's something like the undue burden standard that I mentioned before, Ohio could do things like pass a 24-hour waiting period or provide for informed consent. But honestly, the language here is broader than undue burden. The use of the word indirectly complicates this dramatically. The court would have to define what's an indirect burden, and then they would also have to define what is a burden. Now, the context of this doesn't necessarily define either one of those terms for us, and so it would be up to the Ohio Supreme Court to make those determinations. There's also language in Section B that would allow the state to restrict abortion after viability. Let me read that passage as well. It says, however, abortion may be prohibited after fetal viability, but in no case may such an abortion be prohibited if in the professional judgment of the pregnant patient's treating physician, it is necessary to protect the pregnant patient's life or health. So it would allow the state to restrict abortion. However, if in the treating physician's judgment it is necessary to protect the patient's life or health, abortion would still be accessible. The hard word here is health. So when we look at how the courts have handled that phrase in the past, especially at the Supreme Court level, health has included things like psychological, social, economic, and other factors of health. So essentially, the state has very little leeway to regulate or prohibit abortion after viability if the mother and her physician arrive at a conclusion that her health could be protected, however we define that, by an abortion. So what happens if issue 1 passes? The following Ohio laws would be vulnerable and possibly void: a 24-hour waiting period, parental consent for minors, potentially, protections for birth for children with Down syndrome, the heartbeat bill, and probably more legislation as well. Again, it's possible that through legislation and through the Ohio Supreme Court, some of those things would survive. But so much of this would hinge on how the court understands the language. If issue 1 passes in November, Ohio's approach to abortion would be at least as protective of abortion, if not more so, than the federal standards that existed during the era of Roe v. Wade. In some ways, if Ohio 1 passes, it'll be as if Roe was never overturned in the state of Ohio. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Smith, for that overview of it. I'm looking forward to unpacking this a little bit more with you all, as Brooke mentioned. My name is Aaron Baer. I am the president of Center for Christian Virtue. We are a Christian public policy organization based here in Ohio. Many, if not all, of the pro-life laws regulating abortion in Ohio, we've had our hand involved in one way or another in passing them. Along with leading CCV, I'm also on the board of an organization called Protect Women Ohio. We are the official No on Issue 1 campaign. So I have some hard opinions about this amendment and what it will mean for our state and for you all that hope to make Ohio your home one day. I was excited about coming here tonight in particular. One, because this is a massively important issue, and there's a lot of confusion over it. I appreciate Brooke clarifying for us the difference between August's issue 1 and November's issue 1. I was very much a proponent of the Yes on Issue 1 campaign in August. And we've said a few times, I've had some liberal neighbors on the other side of the fence here for us, both literally and figuratively. And we've just made an agreement that we're just going to trade yard signs for this election from November. And they'll take my yes sign, I'll take their no sign. We'll go on with our lives. Because there is some confusion over this. And it's important for us to provide clarity over what this is. I was also looking forward to tonight, though, because we're speaking all over the state right now on issue 1, and a lot of times I'm having to explain what this is, and Dr. Smith did a far better job of walking through, and I was really looking forward to coming to Cedarville University just to get to talk to some Christian students and Christian friends about why Aaron Baer, as a Christian, as a believer in a holy and loving and merciful God, in a holy and loving, merciful Christ, is so concerned about this, and why I think you students in here especially, but everybody across this area that professes Christ needs to be very much concerned about this issue. I want to just real briefly, and I want to leave a good amount of time to answer your questions, because I think Dr. Smith touched on some very important issues that we want to also unpack with you in the Q&A, so please send those questions in. I want to just talk real quickly from a biblical worldview side on issue 1. And I'm blessed to have my wife here with me, Maria Baer, who works for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and we talk about these things all the time. I think there's some very important worldview challenges in issue 1 that speak to us, and I want to unpack 3 of those in particular. The first is, what does this issue 1 say to us as Christians who are also American citizens? How should we be thinking about this? 2, what does issue 1 say about how we understand children in America? And 3, how does issue 1 challenge what we think about women in America? So let's just unpack those very quickly. First and foremost, whenever we talk about these issues, a political issue in particular, whether it's legislation or a constitutional amendment or a ballot issue or even what's going on in Congress right now, that we get the natural question of, should Christians care? Should we be involved in these political debates, especially right now as the fights are getting ugly. You have names being called and all types of nastiness online about this issue. And so should we as Christians who have a very important Great Commission and a very important call to love our neighbor, to evangelize, to share the good news, should we be involved in this issue? And I take that question very seriously. And a lot of times when I'm having this conversation with folks, with believers, especially young believers, I'll say, well, let's go to God's Word first. Let's look in God's Word of what does He say. And the first place that we'll often go of thinking about Christians engaging with government is Romans 13, right? It's a great place to go. And we'll open up Romans 13, and what does it say at the very beginning? Submit to the governing authorities. And we'll kind of stop right there. And we'll say, look, there it is. Submit to the governing authorities. We as Christians, we're just called to submit to the government and follow what they say, and that we're done with that, and we can focus on our other calls in life of caring for the orphan, the widow, the stranger, and really focusing in there. And I think that's a great place to start, but I think it's missing, if we stop there, it's missing a very important contextual question. And the question is, who is the governing authority? When Paul wrote those words, it was very clear who the governing authority in his time. It was Caesar, right? He lived in an empire. He had some rights as a Roman citizen, but didn't in particular have any say in the direction of his nation. Now the question is, who is the governing authority in our time? A lot of times folks will say, oh, it's the president, or it's the governor, it's the General Assembly, it's Congress, maybe it's the courts. Well, that's not actually right, though. We have a constitution that dictates who is the lead governing authority, the final authority. Where does the buck stop in our nation of deciding the direction and the rules and the policies of our country? It's the first three words. It's we the people. In fact, you Christians in here, you citizens in here, we are one of a blessed generation of Christians throughout history that actually have a say in the direction of our country, right? So when we are actually the ruling, the governing authorities. We decide the direction of our country. And typically, every 2 years we have elections where we delegate authority for folks to make the rules, the actual policies. And every now and again, we get the opportunity in a direct democracy type of situation where we get to vote directly on laws. And right now we have a direct democracy opportunity where we are deciding the policy. You and I, the governing authorities, are in charge of this. And so when we understand that we are indeed the governing authorities here, there's a lot more scripture that talks to us and speaks to what our responsibilities are as governing authorities. Scriptures like Isaiah 10, where it talks about woe to you governing authorities that allow for the fatherless to be oppressed, that allow for wickedness and injustice to happen on your watch. That's my paraphrase. That's the Aaron Standard Version. But go read Isaiah 10. You'll see what I'm talking about. This is you see God have very harsh judgment, very serious words to say for governing authorities that allow for people to be oppressed. And the reality is, if issue 1 passes, there will likely be upwards of 30,000 abortions in Ohio every year. 30,000 unborn children who will lose their lives at the hands of the abortionists every year. That's based on, you go back to about the 2010 abortion report, before Ohio Department of Health abortion report, before a lot of these abortion clinic regulations took effect, and we were killing about 28,000 to 30,000 kids a year at that point in Ohio. And so for us, for you and I as the governing authorities, the question is, are we going to allow that wickedness to rule on our watch? On top of all of the parental consent concerns that Dr. Smith raised, and on top of even the transgender concerns that he raised, will we allow for this to happen on our watch? And ultimately, we are the ones that are responsible for this. Second thing I want to tackle real quick is, what does this issue 1 say about how we view children? And this is a near and dear thing to my heart. I always like talking about this, especially when I'm on college campuses, because my wife and I got married right out of college at 22. We graduated from Ohio University. She actually became a journalist. I couldn't cut it, so I became a lobbyist. And we got married right out of college. And I think the one thing that I feel most convicted about when we came out of college was, I praise God that we got married young. It was one of the greatest blessings of our lives. But we both have since repented of a really unhealthy view of children that we had as young 20-year-olds, right? Understandably so. And it was very much a cultural view. And this abortion amendment really perpetuates this worldview that children are a burden and not a blessing. The children are something that can be discarded. The children can hold people back from reaching their true potential. But the Bible teaches something very different than that. The Bible tells us that children are indeed a blessing. And if you guys leave here with anything tonight, I hope it's first and foremost that you're going to vote no on issue 1. But I also hope it's too that you understand that children are awesome. I've got 2 of them sitting right there, and they're the best part of my life, second to my wife. And I hope you leave understanding that children are something to be protected and cherished and celebrated, and they actually make life better. They make life harder, that's true, but it's the hard stuff that makes life great. And one of the underlying worldviews of this abortion amendment is trying to deny people the blessing of knowing children. And as Christians, we should want to see more kids because they are the greatest joy in our lives. The third thing that this abortion amendment does is it makes a very clear statement about women. And it's twofold that we have to challenge. And it's one of the reasons why we named our campaign Protect Women Ohio. What the abortion industry wants people to believe is that women are not strong enough to have kids. You look at the stories they tell about abortion. You look at the stories that they perpetuate. And it's, oh, these women are in difficult situations. And so they need to be able to have an abortion in order for them to fully realize themselves and fully achieve the things they want in life. And fundamentally underneath that message is saying that women are not strong enough to be able to have children and have a job and have a good life. That is a lie from the pit of hell. The other thing that this abortion amendment tells us is that it is actually a helpful thing for a woman to have the life of her unborn child taken in the womb. Guys, we cannot accept the fundamental premise of the abortion industry that abortion helps women. It does not. Taking the life of an unborn child helps nobody, least of which the child, but especially not the mother. And we have to be very clear about that when we talk about this issue. And we have to be compassionate about it, right? We have to understand that for most women, my wife wrote this article for the Gospel Coalition a few years ago that, most women who get abortions they're not the radical feminist that shouts their abortion. They're women in very difficult situations, and we need to be there for them. And we need to make a world where we have less unplanned pregnancies. But we also have to be very clear that abortion helps nobody. And this amendment, if it passes, will not help children or women in any fold. So as we have a discussion tonight, guys, my biggest challenge to you, first and foremost, is think critically about this. Please send in your questions, but also take everything we say and open up your Bible when you get back to your dorm, when you get back to your home, and shine the light of Scripture on those things and see what the Holy Spirit leads you to. So thank you.
All right, so we'll get into the question portion here now. We have some to get things kicked off. So remember, you can always text the questions that you have to the numbers that are there, the number that's there on those cards. We'll start, Dr. Smith, you covered this a little bit. Much of the conversation about issue 1 centers on abortion, but not a lot about parental rights. Why is that, and could issue 1 possibly change the landscape of parental rights in Ohio? So what would we anticipate going to the Supreme Court or being challenged here?
Again, I think on its face, it would challenge parental rights in Ohio. But the question is whether the court would interpret the language on its face or whether it would interpret the language in a different way. It's not unusual for courts to look at things like legislative context, to look at the things that might affect how they would define terms. And again, as I said in my remarks, it's not unusual for the government to allow for regulations of rights based on age. And so, for example, you have a right to free speech, but that looks different in a school context because of the environment of the school, because of the age of the children involved. And so, yes, it's possible that issue 1 will erode parental rights. I'm not necessarily convinced that's inevitable based on the language, but I would say that it's way more possible based on the language we see there than the language that exists right now without issue 1. And so I would say that issue 1 would jeopardize parental rights, but it's not necessarily clear what would happen with it.
What I would build on that to say, and it's the reason why, especially with Protect Women Ohio, the campaign, we're speaking very clearly that we believe this is a direct assault on parental rights. We believe it will undermine parental consent. And again, I think there's a few things that I want to highlight with that. First and foremost, what the proponents of issue 1 are saying is that all this amendment will do is say that any woman 18 years or older can get an abortion up to the time the child is viable, right? So that's what they're saying this is. If that was their intent, they would have written that one sentence. Any woman 18 or older in Ohio can get an abortion until the child is viable outside the womb. They could have written that one sentence. They chose not to write that one sentence. They chose to write 200 words that Dr. Smith kind of walked through us with, right, on the government shall not directly or indirectly burden reproductive decisions. And they chose all of this vague language that, as he said, is very much open to interpretation. And then you have to look at the people who wrote this language and the people that are pushing this amendment. And actually, even in Cincinnati, there was a story in the Cincinnati Enquirer recently where the head of NARAL Pro-Choice Ohio outright said that parental consent laws threaten children's rights. And their ability, if they've been abused, to be able to get an abortion. And the folks that are pushing this amendment have said in other states, and even up in Michigan now, that there should not be parental consent before an abortion. They believe that children should be able to get abortions without their parents' knowledge or consent. And that is why for us, we're doing everything we can to expose. Listen, again, I think Dr. Smith's analysis, and even what he's really reading out what Dave Yost wrote, our Attorney General. That is a proper legal analysis. And then there's the okay, let's talk about what the political and practical realities of what the proponents of this will have intended to do with this language. And that's why on the Issue 1 campaign, we're saying, guys, listen, the bottom line is that this is what these folks are going to be pushing for, and what they will be able to do, as he said, like under this language, they can make that legal argument. And there is nothing the General Assembly can do to undo it at a certain point, because this is going into the state constitution, and this is the final authority on it.
Speaking of the language, do you believe issue 1 is being pushed more by Ohio voters or outsider groups in order to get this on the ballot?
Yeah, so again, I think I want to be fair on this. I think the answer is yes. You look at where their funding is coming from. They're going to have the vast majority of their funding is going to come from out of state. The folks, the language that we have here is very similar to the language that they just passed in Michigan, right? So there is a massive outside influence involved here on the folks that are pushing this. At the same time, there's a lot of people in Ohio that support this, right? That think abortion should be allowed, certainly up to birth, but also up to viability, right? That I don't want to act like everybody in Ohio agrees with me, even though I think they should. But yeah.
So just to add real quickly, I think it's pretty obvious based on what we've seen since Dobbs that the Republican Party's divided over abortion, more so than the Democratic Party is divided over the issue. Now, I'm not saying that I want that to be the case, but I think that it's clearly the case. And so the challenge right now, I think, for pro-life advocates is to somehow curtail their own partisans and then hopefully build into persuading other people of the validity of their points of view. But I think even based on what we saw in the August issue 1 results, this is a divisive issue, even amongst relatively conservative Ohio voters. That doesn't mean that the November outcome is going to look just like what we saw in August, but when we look at places like Kentucky and Kansas, this is a tough issue for the pro-life movement. And I'm not sure. I'm not a policy advocate. I'm not a lobbyist. I don't function that way. I never want to function that way. No offense. But I'm not sure the pro-life movement was ready for Dobbs, right? It happened, and then it's sort of all these things started to spiral. Money came into states like Ohio and Michigan and other places, and we just really weren't prepared to deal with it. And so this is the consequence that we're looking at right now.
I think there's something really important that Dr. Smith just said there, which is, there is a wide opinion about abortion, what abortion policy should be. And we acknowledge that. And again, at CCV, we very much have an opinion about, the sanctity of human life and the harm of abortion. I just walked through a lot of that. But I think one of the important things about issue 1 is that it would essentially end the entire discussion, right? It would mark Ohio, as was said earlier, with one of the most extreme liberal abortion laws in the country, right? So we would not be able to, in a real meaningful way, especially in terms of limits on abortion and of when abortion can be performed, we would not be able to have a real meaningful debate as Ohio citizens, really for the rest of our lives. Because again, once something goes into the state constitution, it is really the only way you can take it out is by going through that same process again. And this is a very expensive and difficult proposition to do. And so this really ends the discussion and marks Ohio on the furthest left, so left for you guys, meet this way, position on abortion.
You touched on that a little bit. Dr. Smith, how often has the Ohio Constitution been changed, and what does that look like?
I don't remember the exact number. It's 200 plus times that it's been amended, I know. Compare that to the federal Constitution, which after the Bill of Rights has been amended 17 times. And so one of the reasons why I think issue 1 in August was the right thing to do, the Ohio Constitution is just too easy to amend. The initiative process where you can do this through a simple majority vote at the statewide level, frankly, that sounds more like a law to me than it does a constitution. And so Ohio's constitution has sort of grown from being a constitution to being another piece of legislation. And I think that has to be addressed at some point if we want to prevent these kinds of things from taking place, because that does allow external groups with funding to come in, to use this process, and to leverage it to change our fundamental law. And so, our Constitution, I think, is far too easy to amend, and that's why we're seeing them come to Ohio.
It's the reason why, I love how our Lieutenant Governor, John Husted, has said this. Our Ohio Constitution is a beautiful thing. It has great protections for free speech and religious freedom and the specific land plots for the Toledo Hollywood Casino. It just shows how, corporate interests have been able to put their ideas locked into our state constitution. And I think what's also important about this, though, and this is when we're having this constitutional question, it's important to put this abortion amendment in the context of that constitutional conversation, right? Because take the principle of free speech, for example, right? When you think about the U.S. Constitution protection for free speech, right? That is given sort of super authority in law, right? So any law that we try to pass, that the Congress tries to pass, it cannot conflict with that baseline constitutional guarantee. Free speech gets the most protection. So if you're going to try to say people can't say something, it's really difficult, right? That's why you almost never see a slander case win, and you almost never see, even a deceptive advertising case is a really difficult thing to win, because free speech is something that the people of the United States have said this is a supreme protected ideal. That's what's going to happen with abortion if this passes in Ohio, is that the right to an abortion, right, is a supremely protected ideal. And there's so much more that we cannot even begin to unpack of what that will mean down the road. In terms of education and so many other areas. And that's the gravity of what this thing is.
Okay, so I'm going to try to get to all of the questions that are coming in that everybody's submitting, and we thank you for that. This one I have seen quite a bit. So in both of your opinions, and also the League of Women Voters talked about this amendment would also protect the right to other reproductive health actions like access to contraceptive, fertility treatment, miscarriage care. What does that look like in your opinion? The question is phrased, in your opinion, from a Christian perspective, are reproductive rights outside of abortion a bad thing? Things like those that I just listed.
Well, let me say first and foremost, all of that other list, right? Miscarriage care, contraception, all of that, that is, I'm going to talk real politically here with you, so excuse me. That's all a smokescreen, right? None of those issues are in a meaningful way under attack right now, right? And you know how I know that? Because I run one of the most conservative organizations in the state. And if anybody would be looking at those things, it would be a very conservative organization. But no one's talking about going after contraception. No one's talking about those things. They threw those things in this amendment to try to to try to gin up support for this. But it is a lie for them to say that contraception is under attack in Ohio today. The other thing about this too, and actually there was a letter that came out from the Ohio Department of Health the other day that actually criticized, that actually clarified. There's an ad that the other side is running that's saying this right now miscarriage care is under attack in Ohio, and we need to pass issue 1 because miscarriage care, women can't access their miscarriage care. And the Ohio Department of Health actually put out a letter that said women need to understand, if you're having a miscarriage, there is all the care you need out there. Nobody can deny you care because of any of the policies passed by the Ohio General Assembly. The abortion industry has very dangerously tried to confuse prohibitions on abortion with miscarriage care. Those two things are very different, and nobody is undermining miscarriage care. And it's wrong. I have seen women say online that they've been afraid that they're not going to be able to get miscarriage care because of things like the heartbeat bill, and that is a lie the abortion industry has perpetuated to advance their political agenda, and it's very harmful.
So I don't disagree with any of that, but let me just add, in the Dobbs decision, Justice Thomas wrote a concurring opinion where he said, based on the reasoning in Dobbs, then these other constitutional protections should now be vulnerable, like the right to contraceptives and other things. Now, I think Justice Thomas is alone on the court with that opinion. No one else wrote alongside him. No one else affirmed it. But when he said that opened this argument up to seem more credible, I think, than it honestly really is. I don't see any kind of a constitutional movement or any kind of a political movement against those things. I don't foresee that. But unfortunately, he gave it some credence by what could be argued was reasonable legal analysis in terms of was it rational given where he was starting, but really the kind of analysis that is really not anywhere near possibility even on this quite conservative court. And so the confusion, at least to some degree, lies with Justice Thomas on this. Not that he cares, frankly, because he doesn't.
When it comes to voting yes or no for issue 1, the question is, do you believe in abortion in cases of rape or incest? But also, can we talk about whether it passes or fails, what will be protected the way the law is currently?
So there's no harder issue, I think, for people who are pro-life advocates than the questions about rape and incest and what kind of exceptions that should exist. I mean, in my mind, as an evangelical Christian, I believe that we're all created in God's image. I think that includes a child in the womb as well as a child outside of the womb as well as the rest of us. I don't think that child in the womb should be punished for an act that took place outside of that child. The child had nothing to do with it. It's a heinous act. There's no other way to describe rape or incest other than heinous acts that should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. But I don't think an exception should exist just based on those factors. Now, I do think there's an argument to be made for exceptions based on the life of the mother. There are arguments that some evangelical theologians and philosophers make about the difference between a life that's being lived and a potential life that might exist. I know my wife and I talked about this issue when we were going through this process of having children 5 times, by the way, so we talked about it more than most people. But our position was always, if it comes down to that choice, we're going to choose the baby because we felt like that's the position that God was putting us in, and we felt like that was the right choice for us. But I would not feel qualified to tell other people, hey, this is the decision that you've got to make, and there should be a legal standard when it comes to that.
And again, I think there's a couple things here that are important to add to this context. One, issue 1 would lock us into, it would shut down all debate on any conversation on any of this in a meaningful way. I think 2, again, this is, you see the abortion industry on this issue using the rape and incest conversation a lot of times to try to box pro-lifers into a difficult spot because, having advocated for 15 years for pro-life laws, what I've seen is that if we're pushing a pro-life law with or without a rape or incest exception, the abortion industry opposes it just as strong, right? Because again, at the end of the day, when we're talking about children, abortions that are following a situation of rape or incest, it's typically less than 1, if max 2% of the actual abortions that are occurring. And so from an intellectual standpoint of, okay,
do we actually think this is good policy or not, they'll bring up this topic to try to change the narrative, change the conversation. And again, as Dr. Smith said, these are real conversations, real debates that we should be able to have. But the folks that are typically raising this issue on the political scene, at the very least, again, I think there's legitimate questions to have over the kitchen table, but most of the folks that raise this issue on the political scene, they're not actually concerned about it. They're trying to use it to rhetorically box their political opponents into a corner.
That leads me to this question that is phrased: what makes choosing life or death / termination a political battle? How did we get to this point?
I think when you boil politics down to its core, it's inherently political. There's no way to divorce when you boil politics down to its core, it's inherently moral. There's no way to divorce morality from politics itself. Any meaningful policy, any meaningful act of government that has any teeth whatsoever, whether we're talking about a budget, whether we're talking about a law against murder, is inherently rooted in a moral perspective. And so there's no avoiding a moral sensibility when we look at something like legislation, whether we're talking about an issue of abortion or anything else. And so I understand that the comment is often, why do you think you should legislate your morality as opposed to my morality or someone else's? But that comment assumes that we can legislate without a moral point of view, and that's just simply not possible. The better way to phrase it, I think, is whose moral perspective is going to be legislated? That's a fair question, and that's an argument that we have in politics. That's the root of politics. How do we make a decision that reflects the moral point of view that we hold most dear? That's why we're active in politics, to take our moral point of view and turn it into policy. Now, of course, the Constitution limits how we can do that, right? The Constitution has restrictions on establishment of religion, so we can't use that policy to create a state church. We get that. But that doesn't mean we can't take our moral point of view into the public square, argue for our perspective, and hope that legislation gets passed based on it. So I appreciate the question, but I think it starts from a premise that I would challenge.
And if I may, just because this is where I'm spending my time reading right now, if you want to see the difference between basing a nation of laws on a broadly biblical perspective, right? I would not say that the founders of America were all Christians. That's certainly not the case. But the predominant understanding of the world around us was a biblical perspective, I'd argue. And that of a non-biblical perspective, go research the American Revolution and the French Revolution happening at the same time, and see a lot of heinous acts. Again, it wasn't to say that the American Revolution was without its faults and without its hardships and sins that were committed. But this is one of these perspectives where we really want to encourage Christians, as Center for Christian Virtue, to not check their faith at the door when they go into the polling box. Because I will tell you, your non-Christian friends are not checking their morality at the door when they go into the voting box. And the Constitution tells us that you have every right to keep your moral standard. Whether you call that still small voice in your head Jiminy Cricket or you call it the Holy Spirit, it is valid in the eyes of the Constitution, and you shouldn't be bullied away from voting your perspective.
All right, I have a question for each of you. I'll start with Dr. Mark Caleb Smith. What are some good resources to educate ourselves on legal language so we can poke holes in the marketing present in the policy? And they thank you for coming tonight.
It's a great question. The best resource is to take my classes on constitutional law. They're offered here regularly, so for those of you that are interested in learning more, I'm always available. I do think in most situations, the states do typically put out pretty good descriptors of things like amendment language, and so I think Attorney General Yost's description of the language is fair. I understand why people might say, well, if you think it's fair, it's probably biased, but I really do think it's reasonably fair. And so I think look for good resources there. Unfortunately, I really can't point to always easily accessible media resources, because I think sometimes media gets caught up in the narrative surrounding hot button cultural issues like abortion. I think there's no substitute for educating yourself, reading law, reading the Constitution, and the cases that surround it, and learning to interpret it on your own. Because if you're relying on other authorities to feed that interpretation to you, then you're pretty susceptible to misinformation. And right now, that's one of the biggest problems that we have.
Yeah, and I'll say it at CCV, we put together a number of resources that very much come from our perspective on what this is. And a lot of those resources, when you leave today, are going to be out on the table. We have an explainer on issue 1. We also have some resources on issue 2. We are opposing issue 2, the legalization of marijuana as well. But we have resources that really take the language that Dr. Smith went over and kind of breaks it down, say this is why we say it means this. And a lot of those resources are made specifically for churches. We have video explainers, all those things. ccb.org/vote has all those resources, and they'll also be on the table when you leave today.
One of the questions is going to be for you personally about how you got to your views on that. And I'm going to save that for a little bit later so we can make sure we get to some of these others. I think it'll be a good one to end on. If issue 1 does pass, will this automatically become an amendment that will immediately be enacted in Ohio, or are there more steps involved to actually make it an Ohio constitutional amendment?
Now, the amendment itself says that it's self-executing, and so there's no legislation that need to be passed. There's no delay. I don't know technically if they would wait until December 1st or something, but I would assume it would go into effect immediately, and there would be no other action that would be required out of the General Assembly or the governor or anyone else for it to become binding.
And I think just real quick to his point earlier and what Dave Yost said, a lot of the claims that we're saying this is going to do this, these will play out over the years to come, because as Dr. Smith said, this is all, now it all becomes about constitutional interpretation. And so, you know, a lot of these things that you're hearing about, okay, so what does it mean that the government cannot directly or indirectly burden, interfere with, discriminate against someone's reproductive decisions? That could mean a lot of things, and things we might not be even thinking of today.
Okay, let's get to some of these other questions here towards the bottom. All right, this is a longer one. What kind of a response should be given to pro-choice advocates regarding the idea that it is grace instead that a child never experiences the sins of the father? From a secular standpoint, wouldn't the only other option then be to support these women with more positive rights and subsequently higher tax rates? How are Republicans able to unite on that issue? It sounds like it's a question of supporting women in general.
I think that one of the things that evangelicals can do a little better at, honestly, is understanding the centrality of abortion to the worldview of many people in our country. So if you read the feminist political theory, and if you read the literature, they characterize the act of abortion as a fundamental element of equality. And without abortion, they perceive themselves as unequal in society, unequal in the workplace, unequal in the educational sphere. And so for them, a threat against abortion is really a threat against their status. That's how they process it. And I think unless we understand that perspective, we won't understand really the extent of the resistance to what we're trying to do. And so I think once you begin to grapple with how important it is to their worldview, you can begin to say, okay, how can we figure out a way to address some of those concerns, either legislatively or in other ways, and still deal with abortion? I think evangelicals in general have been a little bit narrow in their focus on the issue of abortion sometimes. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be vital and it shouldn't be an important part of what we do, but I do think there are arguments to be made about caring for life, broadly speaking, not just simply life in the womb. And so I think we have to be a little bit, sometimes we're a little ideologically rigid when it comes to these kinds of questions. And I think we need to be a little more creative and maybe willing to make arguments that are a little bit unorthodox in some ways to appeal to people, to say, you know, we're really interested in caring for people. We want the government to be in a position to care for people who are in serious need. We want to create organizations that will care for people in a variety of contexts, not just abortion. And so I think sometimes we need to broaden our perspective so we make a little bit more credible cultural arguments as well as economic and political arguments as well.
The question is phrased, how likely is it that issue 1 will not pass? But I guess the bigger question is when you're looking at, as we head into November and the demographic of our state, what do you anticipate?
I'm guessing it's probably better for me to answer this question than it is for you. If I had to bet, you know, and I don't, but if I had to bet, I would say it will probably pass. Now, it doesn't mean I'm hoping that it will pass, but I think based on demographics, based on what happened in August, the odds are probably in favor of it passing. Now, I think there's momentum on the no side. I think they're heading in a good direction. I think the polling reflects that momentum. Maybe as more people become involved and interested and invested in the issue, we'll see those numbers flip a little bit. But from a purely pragmatic political science perspective, I think it's trending in favor of yes there, but we'll see.
So, again, I'm very biased here. I'm on the no campaign, and what I will just say is, 6 to 8 months ago, when the polling came out, it was looking really grim. But what we're seeing now in our internal polling, and what we're seeing now in, especially a lot of the messaging that we have up, many of you might have seen the ad that Governor DeWine and Fran DeWine cut. We believe we have found some very direct and honest messages that are resonating broadly with folks, and the encouraging things we're seeing is that our folks have realizing another election's coming up, and realizing what it is, and the more we're able to expose it, the more they are moving naturally over to our side, right? Again, this is from the ad Governor DeWine is in, where it says, listen, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, this just goes too far, right? I think that's what Fran DeWine said in the ad. And so actually from our perspective, we see a real path to victory. I think there's some very important distinctions between our effort here in Ohio compared to Michigan, and compared to these other states. It is, we want to acknowledge, it is an uphill battle, right? We're probably going to get outspent 2-1. And so, that's why, he called me a lobbyist. I'm going to call him a political prognosticator. The political prognosticators look at this and say, listen, this side has more money. This side has a media that's much more favorable to them. There's a lot of things that go on with that. But we have a governor that's great, that's been really good on this issue for us. We have the churches that are really waking up in ways that we haven't seen before. The dioceses have really engaged here on the Catholic side. And so we really do believe we're going to win, and that we're in great position to do so.
Okay, we probably only have time for about one or two more questions here. So the way that this one is phrased, won't this proposed amendment, if passed, conflict with that idea that the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment of free speech and religion is the ultimate authority? And if issue one, if passed, would conflict with and violate our First Amendment right to speak out to protect the unborn human being's right to live?
Again, what I would just say real simply to that is that is one of the fundamental questions that's going to have to get adjudicated, right? The way this thing, with its 200 words and vagaries and all of that, are going to interact with not just the rest of the Ohio Constitution, but also the U.S. Constitution, is a great unknown in a lot of those, especially those speech contexts that you're saying. That is something we've looked at with this and said, when it says that the government shall not directly or indirectly interfere with an individual, mind you, they won't say the word woman in this, they say individual because apparently they think men can get pregnant. But when it says that the government shall not interfere directly or indirectly interfere with a woman's right to get an abortion, well, does that impact somebody's ability to counsel women on their alternatives to abortion? We don't know. Is that indirectly interfering with a woman's ability to get an abortion? If you say, hey, I actually think abortion's bad for you, there's a real legal argument that could be had there that we won't know until this passes, and the better alternative is just to not pass it.
Do you want to touch on that one at all? Okay. This one, let me find the one that was for you earlier. For Mr. Baer, someone has asked, can you identify any particular interaction, realization, or argument that spurred you toward your personal pro-life stance?
She's sitting right in front of me. I will say when I really professed Christ at 17, really wanted to get strong about my faith, so I picked a good conservative institution to go to at Ohio University. Really, though, had some great, at the time I was my first political activity was in 2004 when I worked on the John Kerry for President campaign. You guys, do any of you guys know who John Kerry? He was a Democrat. He ran against George Bush, very, very pro-abortion position I had, and both because of some pastors I had at the time, and my wife and I started dating in college, and we just had some really great conversations about the topics of abortion, and both Maria and my pastors pressed me into God's word to say, what is, we are crucifying our old selves when you become a Christ, and you're putting on a new life, and that means you're crucifying your understandings of the world and looking through the world through a clearer lens. And that process really brought me around to understanding the harm of abortion. It also made me understand that the vast majority of people who would call themselves pro-choice don't understand this as an issue of murder. That doesn't make it not murder, right? That doesn't make it not taking the life of an unborn child, but it also changes the way we engage in the debate. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention a very important book to me that I read at the time, which was a book by an old mentor of mine who recently passed away, a guy named Tom Minery, who wrote a book called Why You Can't Stay Silent. I read that in college, and it really impacted the way I understand politics, really impacted the way I understand Christian civic engagement. And it's still available on Amazon, and I read it about a year ago, and it still holds up, so I would recommend that to you.
All right, one final question. We'll wrap things up. Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, if issue 1 passes, you touched on this a little bit. Could the Ohio Constitution be changed back? What do you envision moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it could be changed back, but like Aaron said, that's an expensive process. It's an onerous process, and I think it would be very difficult to do. Culturally, once that's in place as well, you're going to have to peel back sort of a cultural expectation that Ohio is sort of pro-choice. And so I think the odds would be against it, at least in the short term. Maybe a long-term goal, but I think unlikely in the short term.
Yeah, and I want to just add one last little piece of color on this from the constitutional standpoint, right? When you go home tonight, along with opening up God's Word and looking at this, I also want you to open up the U.S. Constitution and go read the 14th Amendment. And find for me in the 14th Amendment where it creates a right to abortion. And understand this is where a lot of Roe came out of. Now understand that the legal minds that are behind the abortion industry use the 14th Amendment. That's an amendment that talks about citizenship and naturalizing citizenships, and any individual born in America is a citizen of the country. They took that amendment to create a right to abortion. Understand the legal gymnastics they did to get there. And then look at this abortion amendment and understand what they will be able to do with this language. And it is very fair, and it should, when you understand the radical nature of the folks behind this and their agendas that they're promoting in other states that they're trying to hide in Ohio right now, what they will use this language to do to advance their agenda in our state and lock it in for the rest of our lives.
All right, we are out of time. I want to thank you all for letting me be a part of this forum tonight. I'm sure many of you are walking out of here confident in how you're going to vote. Some of you, it may be a more complex issue than that. So I really appreciate being here tonight. Aaron Baer, the president of the Center for Christian Virtue, and Dr. Mark Caleb Smith, the director of the Center for Political Studies here at Cedarville University. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.